In nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. Vieni Santo Spirito, riempi il cuore dei tuoi fedeli e accendi in essi il fuoco del tuo amore. Manda il tuo Spirito e ogni cosa sarà creata. Preghiamo. O Padre, che nella luce dello Spirito Santo guidi i credenti alla conoscenza piena della verità, donaci di gustare nel tuo Spirito la vera sapienza e di godere sempre del suo conforto. Per Cristo nostro Signore.
Amen.
Ave Maria, piena di grazia, il Signore è con te. Tu sei benedetta fra le donne e benedetto è il frutto del tuo seno, Gesù.
Santa Maria, Madre di Dio, prega per noi peccatori, adesso è l'ora della nostra morte. Amen.
Gloria al Padre, e al Figlio, e allo Spirito Santo.
Come era nel principio, ora e sempre, nei secoli dei secoli. Amen.
Regina Apostolorum.
Ora pro nobis.
Del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. Buon pomeriggio a tutti, sia a quelli presenti in aula, sia a quelli che ci seguono da Bologna e poi quelli che ci seguiranno tramite internet. Oggi avremo ben due conferenze. La prima conferenza sarà tenuta dal dottor Robert Hesse, che è diacono e cofondatore e presidente di una rete, la Contemplative Network, che è dedicata alla preghiera contemplativa cristiana interdenominazionale, cioè ecumenica. E poi anche è membro del direttivo di questa rete di preghiera contemplativa e anche pratica proprio la preghiera contemplativa nella tradizione trappista. E si è ispirato al monastero di Getsemani dei trappisti, dove c'era tempo fa come monaco trappista il famoso Thomas Merton. E poi ha diversi altri incarichi, soprattutto nell'ambito anche medico e in rapporto anche con il Dalai Lama. E poi è anche vice capo, membro della facoltà dell'Istituto per la Spiritualità e la Salute, che si trova negli Stati Uniti, nel Texas Medical Center, che è il più grande centro medico nel mondo in molti momenti. Bene, poi è anche un professore, istruttore alla Rice University e anche professore aggiunto all'Università di St. Thomas, sempre negli Stati Uniti. Bene, c'è altri incarichi, però adesso, per non togliere il tempo, perché purtroppo per questioni tecniche abbiamo cominciato anche un po' tardi, io do a lui la parola oggi. Thank you very much for coming here again. È già venuto in altre occasioni a tenere delle conferenze da noi per il Master Scienze e Fede, e oggi appunto ci parlerà di questo argomento molto importante, il tema dei miracoli, ma anche il misticismo, e questo nel contesto appunto tra la scienza e la fede. Dunque vi lascio in buone mani. Adesso, come sapete, ci sarà la traduzione simultanea. Purtroppo non è stato possibile predisporlo per farlo a distanza, almeno per videoconferenza. Successivamente vi invieremo il file con la traduzione audio. Bene, grazie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Raphael. I appreciate the invitation and the honor. I have to apologize in advance that I'm going to have to leave promptly with a taxi at the front door at 5, so please forgive me if you see me rush out. But you're going to see here my email address and a web page, and so if there are any dialogue or questions you'd like to have afterwards or later, just please feel free to contact me. You're going to see that the title is Miracles and Mysticism, and it's reflections on the unknowable. The subtitle is actually the title of a book that is a wonderful book by Father Thomas Keating. And the title may seem a little strange, but I think that as we get into this, miracles may be a form of mysticism, a form of mystical experience that may not be as dramatic as John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, but I'd like to explore that concept a little bit. The discussion will be in a certain outlined form. I'll give a quick historical perspective. Then, if we're going to talk about miracles, the most logical place to start is with Jesus' miracles. Then, we're going to discuss the scientific unknowns that might create an avenue for miracles to occur. And then perhaps mystical experiences that might be examples of how miracles can occur. And then a look to the future. I'll be mixing faith and science together, but I want to make it clear right up front that science cannot show how miracles are done. But that doesn't keep the human mind from exploring possibilities. So we will start with a historical perspective. Historically, miracles have been looked upon in three different ways. One is violations of the natural law, in which case God gives us a message, but there's a violation of natural law. The other is the message of faith is the most important thing, not science. It might be considered, but it's not really considered very seriously. And the third is faith and reason together, basically applying faith and science together. We're going to be looking more at the last step, but one of the quotes, in spite of that historical basis, one of the quotes that I think is so important is St. Augustine of Hippo that said, "Miracles are not contrary to nature, but only contrary to what we know about nature." And isn't that a wonderfully powerful statement? Basically, it's saying that even though some historical perspective have said that it's not what. Did I lose something here? Bear with me here a minute. For some reason, isn't what really happened, but miracle is a natural law. In other words, to look at it isn't really what really happened, and that is not a good way to look at it, because it's saying there's an exception to natural law. And the real miracle is our existence, our very existence, the universe and our existence in it. That's the real miracle. And to look for an exception is almost like insulting to God, in a sense. He's created this wonderful universe, and now we're saying, but impress us some more. We want an exception. And so this was kind of the historical view at one time. And they would say, well, what it really is the meaning that's conveyed. A miracle does tell us something, but what about reason? And so the message is the most important thing. And it's important that we analyze with our reason how these things might have happened, because it may give us insight into the meaning, even though science cannot show how miracles occur. Okay? Science and religion can renew culture which embraces everything of which man is at once the center, the subject, and the object. Faith can never conflict with reason. And this is Pope St. John Paul II. So we're going to be relying on these quotes from various people in order to proceed down this path of faith and science. Euclid of Alexandria, "The laws of nature are but the mathematical thoughts of God." Interesting quote. Albert Einstein, "There are only two ways to live your life. One is though nothing is a miracle, and the other is as though everything is a miracle." In a sense, Einstein was saying what we're talking about being the real miracle, and that is creation itself, rather than looking for an exception to it. And perhaps another quote from C.S. Lewis, whom I have a lot of respect for: miracles are a retelling in small letters of the very same story, which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. Rather interesting approach to miracles. And for the final quote from Willa Cather, she's an author in the United States, which I think gives some really interesting insight into miracle. Where there is great love, there are always miracles. One might almost say that an apparition is a human vision corrected by divine love. I do not see you as you really are. I see you through my affection for you. The miracles of the Church seem to me to rest not so much upon faces or voices or healing power coming suddenly near to us from afar off, but upon our perceptions being made finer, so that for a moment our eyes can see and our ears can hear what is there about us always. What she's describing is this concept of the mystical approach to miracles, which we will explore a little bit more. Now, in terms of Jesus' miracles, this is just a listing of all his healing miracles. We're not going to go through all of them. We all know them in Scripture. And of course, then he had a certain number of miracles related to nature. And so the question is, what do these all have in common? Well, the primary message, as we all know, is, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. So the prime message is that. However, his methods were rather interesting. The physical aspect, and it should be 1 and 2 here, by the way, the physical aspect is what is quite often part of the cure. People thought illness was a punishment for sin. So he was partially trying to rectify that question, and he certainly got credibility from healing the sick, but he always would he would always say afterwards, the spiritual side of the healing, and that is forgiveness of sin is part of the healing. He would always wrap the physical with the spiritual. And so basically what he was doing is banking on the non-dualism that we believe in as Catholics, and that is that the physical and the spiritual, the body and the soul, reason and faith, science and theology, have to be consistent with each other. And by that I mean that our interpretation of them has to be consistent. And if our interpretation of those is inconsistent, then our interpretation of one or the other or both are wrong. Now, the problem with the physical and the spirit and the science is that there are a lot of unknowns that we can never know by the very definition of the scientific principles, which we'll talk about. Pope St. John Paul II said, there exist 2 realms of knowledge, one which has its source in revelation faith, and one which with reason science can discover by its own power. To the latter belong especially the experimental sciences and philosophy. The true realms have points of contact. The methodologies proper to each make it possible to bring out different aspects of reality. Again, by Pope John Paul II, the scientist's condition as a sentinel in the modern world, the first to glimpse the enormous complexity together with the marvelous harmony of reality, makes him a privileged witness of the plausibility of religion, a man capable of showing how the admission of transcendence, far from harming the autonomy and the ends of research, rather stimulates it to continually surpass itself in experience of self-transcendence, which reveals the human mystery. Now, I'm going into a little bit more detail than perhaps we would normally expect, but I want to be sure that in the encyclicals of John Paul II, the message is clear that we have to think in both realms, that God reveals himself both through Scripture and tradition and nature. Another quote from John Paul, I see also the science of faith on the horizon of rationality understood in this way, The church wants independent theological research which is not identified with the ecclesiastical magisterium. Interesting quote. So, faith and science relationship is of interest here before we get into the miracles aspect. Again, John Paul, science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from false absolutes. And Einstein, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. So, as we go into this, quite often scientists will muse and hypothesize how miracles might happen, and it's usually approached through the scientific unknowns because we don't know how miracles occur and whether there's a room within the science and the unknowable of God being the unknowable, that science feels there may be ways that miracles can occur. So there are potential determinacies that various scientists and theologians, combination scientists, theologians, have postulated. One is the quantum determinacy. The other, I'll talk about each of these a little bit further. The second is dissipative nonlinear thermodynamic issues, and the third is chaos theory. Now, the first is the uncertainty principle by Werner Heisenberg. The more precisely the electron position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known, and vice versa. So basically, some people are postulating that God could change the location of electrons, and it would be perfectly consistent with science, but because nature, by its very design, is not knowable, and that's really what this principle says, that we cannot know nature completely. Very interesting concept. That by the fact we can't know it completely, God could dabble in that area and we would never know it, and he would not be violating the laws of nature. Now, I'll continue on in other possibilities. Ian Barber talks about that concept, very much of an author in this subject. God is the ultimate determiner of the indeterminacies of the quantum level. So, in theory, God could dabble in that area without violating the laws of nature. It's just that we wouldn't know how it was done. Dissipative structures. Prignoni won the Nobel laureate, was a Nobel laureate for this concept. A dissipative system is a thermodynamically open system which is operating out of and often far from thermodynamic equilibrium in an environment with which it exchanges energy. Now that's a fancy phrase, but what it comes down to is that the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy has to increase all the time. And so when you look at the human being, you say, well, the human being is very organized. How can that be without violating the second law of thermodynamics? Well, in certain circumstances under dissipative structures, it can happen. And we don't know exactly how often that happens. We can observe it, but the mechanism is pretty unknown. And chaos theory, I'll list all three of these basically. Just in a nutshell, chaos theory, you probably have already studied it. Forgive me if I repeat myself, but or repeat your learning. But in chaos theory, scientists were using the power of computers to predict weather patterns, and they came to realize that with a small tweak in bad input, huge differences in the output would occur. And they were able to do this, discover this theory, because they were dealing with simple numbers of variables. But in true life, there are so many variables that we as humans cannot possibly calculate outcomes from just all of the variables. And if we miss input by a slight amount, it messes up the result terribly. So even graphing chaos, so basically chaos is not chaotic. And the butterfly effect was their way of saying that if a butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing, there will be a weather change in New York sometime later. And it's true. However, predicting that is impossible. And they've even graphed chaos, and there are patterns in the graphing that are beautiful, even though we cannot determine them. So these are the three areas of how God could have determinacies of miracles. However, and again the number system's off, those three we just talked about are micro, in a sense micromanagement. Uncertainty, dissipative structures, chaos. And it's hard to imagine a macro outcome from these micro adjustments. Now that doesn't mean God couldn't do this in those ways. Remember, we don't know how miracles occur, but we also are not going to throw out our ability to apply reason to them. What I'd like to explore here is another approach, and that is more of a macro approach, and that is altered states of consciousness. Now, the saints talk about altered states of consciousness in describing mystical or contemplative experiences. And Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, are the giants in this area. And so to talk about this, we need to first talk about what's conscious and what's unconscious in the brain. The conscious is quality or state of being aware of an external object or something within oneself. The unconscious is the mind operating well outside the attention of the conscious mind, altered states of consciousness with altered consciousness awareness. Now, what's interesting about those two states of the brain is, and this is just a quick run-through, the conscious brain is actually very slow, unconscious very fast, conscious is systematic, unconscious is automatic, conscious explicit, unconscious implicit, conscious is very analytic, unconscious very heuristic, rule-based conscious, intuitive unconscious, proactive conscious, reactive unconscious, reflective is conscious, unconscious is more impulsive. In the brain, the conscious is related more to the neocortex, and the unconscious, the limbic system. The conscious is the youngest part of the brain, the unconscious, the oldest. So the conscious is 5% of the brain, the unconscious is 95% of the brain. Now, to understand this a little bit better, I use an analogy that was given by David Eagleman in a book called Incognito, where he likened the conscious brain to the president of a company and the problem solver, and the unconscious being the implicit workers on the assembly line. And so our normal breathing is unconscious, thank God, because if we had to think about it 24 hours a day, we would die pretty quickly. So it's a wonderful thing to have the unconscious. But if something goes wrong on the assembly line, the unconscious brain doesn't know how to deal with it, so it pushes the decision to the conscious brain, which analytically studies over the problem and solves it. So there are conflicts in the human brain that are necessary for us to function. And Walt Whitman, in A Song of Myself, said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And the brain functions through contradiction, and that's part of why artificial intelligence is struggling and won't be able to get there. So one of the tests of conscious brain was done on a rat. And they put electrical charge on cheese. The rat went to eat the cheese, got shocked, and backed off. Now, then the rat went into a catatonic state, and basically it had a conflict. It didn't know if it should eat the cheese to live or not eat the cheese to live. Now, we humans would have that conflict pushed to the conscious brain, and we would say, well, let's look for the plug and unplug it. But the rat doesn't have a conscious brain, and this is one of the measurements that some scientists refer to as a measurement of whether an animal has a conscious brain. So one of the quotes that I like is, if the brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. Emerson Pugh. Unconscious faith, I cannot grasp all that I am. St. Augustine. This is Kevin Nelson in his Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, neuroscientist. Consciousness will never fully understand itself unconscious, no matter how much we peek inside the brain. Now here we're getting into the scientific unknowns with the potential for the sourcing of how God can communicate to us without us really knowing how he does it. Max Planck, Nobel laureate for quantum theory, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So even physicists are realizing that consciousness is such a frontier in science that a lot of the science researchers are now looking and trying to find consciousness in the brain. Roger Penrose, who was the assistant to Stephen Hawking, wrote a book, The Emperor's New Mind, and this is a quote from that, and I thought it was an interesting book. Consciousness seems to me to be such an important phenomenon that I simply cannot believe that it is something just accidentally conjured up by a complicated computation. It is the phenomenon whereby the universe's very existence is made known. One can argue that a universe governed by laws that do not allow for consciousness is no universe at all. Think about that in terms of the anthropic principle, which I'm sure you've already studied or heard about. So, then we go on to other, this is a neurosurgeon, Eben Alexander, Proof of Heaven, a book that he wrote. The brain itself doesn't produce consciousness. That is, it is instead a kind of reducing valve or filter, sifting the larger non-physical consciousness that we possess in the non-physical worlds down into a more limited capacity for the duration of our mortal lives. Now think back on Cather's quote and this quote. Now he had a profound near-death experience. That's what brought him to this conclusion. And there are those that believe that consciousness, or that the unconscious may be outside of the brain. So what are the relative magnitudes? I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but basically the brain and the universe are huge. And 100 billion cells in the brain, 170 plus billion galaxies. We're talking about magnitudes here that are huge. But what's interesting is the very bottom two. Again, 5% conscious in the brain, 95 unconscious. And in the universe, 4% visible, 96% invisible dark energy and dark matter. These are incredible unknowns in science that we've got to be very humble in looking at and realizing that God has many vehicles to communicate his love to us. And that's what a miracle is. It's a communication of love, a mystical experience, in my opinion. So, now that we are talking about this as potentially mystical experiences, what have scientists referred to in the mystical experiences? Well, Carl Jung, we were talking about it earlier, talked about mystical synchronicity, related events occurring not by chance or causality. So Jung and others had started to recognize in their patients and a psychologist that there was a connection between events, but they weren't causal. Mark Twain was a real big believer in synchronicity. So there are a number of people that have recognized this, and I think we recognize this in our own lives. It's almost a God thing that we recognize that he's giving us a hint here and a hint there. In my view, a peek under that mystical tent, in a little miracle to tell us. And I've experienced a number of these, and I think those who are open to these experience those and recognize them. I think they happen to everybody, but unless we're open to this, we will discount them as statistical anomalies, when in fact they very well may be God speaking to us. Albert Einstein, the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. Isn't this rather interesting? Even from Einstein, this thought is coming. Now, there are forms of prayer that can lead to these mystical experiences, but miracles don't necessarily come through just prayer. They can happen in a synchronicity mode, or something that comes to our unconscious and moves into the conscious mind. It's interesting about conscious and unconscious. The unconscious mind contains not just breathing, but it contains all of our habitual virtues and our habitual sins. And sometimes we need to have that unconscious unloaded into the conscious brain in order to become aware of things. And suffering can push the unconscious into the conscious brain. Even though God doesn't want us to suffer, it's a way that the brain deals with suffering quite often. We tolerate something and then it comes into the conscious brain. So it's, and prayer is another way that the unconscious can unload into the conscious brain. So let's talk about this concept of that unloading of the unconscious, okay? Now, I gave some examples here. A guided meditation is discursive, cataphatic, contemplative prayer, apophatic, an example of centering prayer. There are other examples, Lectio Divina, etc. And this unconscious unloading quite often happens more in the latter rather than the former, more in the apophatic than cataphatic. But it can happen at either place or even outside of prayer. The psychological effects of these unloadings can be these virtues, and most of them are pleasurable, but the unloading psychological effect can be a painful thing. I'll give you an example. I've taught centering prayer to many people, and I asked one man who came back about 3 months later, I said, "How is it going?" And he said, "At night I started to dream of what really happened to me in Vietnam." And I said, "What did you do then?" And he said, "Then I became fully aware during the day." Now, centering prayer is a form of concentrative prayer on a symbol of our desire to be with God. It might be a word or image, so that we gently let go of our thoughts and return to God. I said to him, "What did you do then?" And he said to me, "I gently let go and return to God." Now, the Texas Medical Center in Houston is the largest in the world, and I talked to the head of the psychiatric department of one of those hospitals who treats PTSD patients, post-traumatic stress disorder patients, and told him this story, and he was stunned. His mouth dropped. He said, "We are having difficulty treating PTSD patients." Now here the divine healer was healing this man through the unloading of that unconscious into the conscious brain. In my view, this was miraculous. That's why I link miracles and mysticism more than perhaps other ways, okay? So there are altered consciousnesses taking place quite often in these prayer practices. the virtues that that come out of this I just talked about, that happens quite often, and normally outside the prayer practice. But true contemplative experiences, anecdotally, I have observed, and I've talked to Keating about this, happen 5 to 10% of the time. It's less often. I believe God knows when we need His help and when He can just give us gentle reminders, and then when we really need dramatic reminders. These are the experiences that Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross talk about. And there is a sense of oneness, of omnipresence in the universe, timelessness. Prayer seems short. It's very classic. Wholeness, a perfection, a sense of completeness. And some people, a form of ecstasy or out-of-body experience, which the saints talk about. And again, miracles may be little mystical experiences that we can't pin down, but we know God is there for us. We cannot understand it scientifically. So, now out-of-body experiences have actually been studied, and they're in their brain areas that have been studied to show where this might happen in the brain. Now, does that mean we know how God does it? No. But I wanted to demonstrate here from a friend of mine, Stan Golden, who teaches at Harvard Medical School, and he's a very spiritual person. And he shows the different parts of the brain that embodiment and empathy show, embodiment, moral judgment, and conflict resolution, etc. And so there are parts of the brain that are related to out-of-body experiences scientists are starting to study. Okay? Mystical experiences by William James, varieties of religious experience. Our present consciousness is only one out of many worlds of consciousness that exist. Which worlds must contain experiences which have a meaning for our life? Also, and then he gives the attributes of these mystical experiences. This was back in 1902, so these attributes are very similar to what I just showed you, and very similar to the mystical writings of the mystics in the Catholic Church. So there's a consistency throughout the centuries in describing these. Now, let's apply this concept of mysticism as a form of miracles as a form of mysticism, in interpreting the miracles of Jesus. And this is just one interpretation. What I'm suggesting here is that if we include science in our view of miracles, it may lead us to a different interpretation of miracles that might actually enhance the reception of the message, which is the most important part. The most important thing is the message, but understanding it might actually enhance it. So, stilling the storm on the Sea of Galilee. This was a nature miracle. My father was in World War II and was on the Queen Mary being shipped to the European theater for the war. And it was on the Queen Mary, and they removed the gyroscope on the ship to make room for more troops. Well, needless to say, when the ship arrived, everybody was sick. The ship was just being tossed all around. The gyroscope is a massive piece of equipment. It's a spinning top that keeps it stable. You've seen tops that spin on a table. That's how it works. It rights the ship so that no matter what the storm is, the ship is steady. What if consciousness was a mechanism that Jesus used to quell and give peace to the apostles that were saying to him, Jesus, wake up, we're going to drown, don't you care? And he said to them through the unconscious and into their conscious brain, I'm here with you. I am your internal gyroscope. So perhaps it wasn't the storm that he quelled, but the storm within their conscious brain. And in a sense, isn't that a more powerful message than saying that he quelled the actual storm itself? He gave them strength in their innermost being. To me, that enhances Jesus' message more. Second, feeding thousands of the loaves and fish. Now, perhaps you've heard these other interpretations, but they all relate to a presence that Jesus can give us through the conscious and the unconscious. It's inconceivable, I think, that nobody showed up with fish and bread, only this young man. And when Jesus said, he's got bread, he's sharing it with you, the message was, please love one another and share with each other. So when the basket was passed around, those who brought a little bit more got the message that Jesus gave to their conscious and unconscious brain, and it made it to the unconscious into the conscious brain, and they put their extra loaves in. So that in the end, the message got through to the conscious brain of these people. They became sharers of their love, just like that young man did. He didn't actually have to multiply moles and fish. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should give up your view of this miracle. I'm only suggesting that looking at the science of the brain, and that Jesus has obviously the power to work through our brain, that may be a more powerful message in miracle. Restoring sight to the man that was blind since birth. Let's talk about this from the standpoint of a case study. Michael May was a man who was blind from about 3 months. When he was about 3 months old, roughly, there was an explosion and he lost his sight. And in a very unusual surgical procedure, very rare, at age 45, roughly, they performed surgery on his eyes and restored his sight. Profound. And in front of him were his children and his wife, whom he had never seen before. They unwrapped the bandages, and for the first time he saw them. But there were problems. He couldn't remember his wife's face from one day to the next. He couldn't tell the difference between this forest and the trees, depth perception. He had trouble distinguishing a moving ball and a moving box. What he lacked was the wiring in the brain that takes place through our early childhood, where we're bombarded with a huge amount of data from our five senses, and we build a worldview in our unconscious so that we don't have to analyze all that data all the time. So I remember a person's face because my unconscious has built a caricature of that face, where I see a mole here, and immediately my brain says that's so-and-so, and it's unconscious. What Michael May had to do was his brain had to start wiring itself so that he could have not just sight, but insight into what was happening. It could be wired, and that's what actually happened. With time, he started to have the unconscious get the data loaded into a worldview where he could recognize his wife's face. Now, back to the miracle. Jesus restores sight to the blind man. Did he just restore sight, or did he restore insight? Interesting. In the scripture reading this past Sunday, at the very end of the gospel, it said, and the man followed Jesus. He remembered Jesus' face. That was the insight miracle. And in a sense, that was the message of the gospel. It wasn't that he just was going to give him sight. He was going to give him insight into Jesus. What a powerful message in light of what we know about Michael May. So, it's about 4:20. We got some time here. I'd like to explore the future. Just experiment with the future of faith and science, okay? Which is becoming rapidly the present. When you look at the unified consciousness, which is what I call unified consciousness, and you look at the mystical, the singularity, and the near-death experiences, and forgive these numbers, I don't know how that happened, but 1, 2, 3, 4, visualize, okay? And I also don't know why I didn't have this program properly, but focus on the mystical experiences, okay? We went through those mystical experience characteristics already that the mystics throughout the centuries talk about. And timelessness, wholeness, oneness, spaceless, ecstasy. These are the characteristics of mystical experiences. Now, if you look at those people who relate to what their near-death experiences were, if you jump to the right, they are analogous. Cognitive, timelessness, affective, a sense of peace, transcendent, sometimes people would see angels, etc. Paranormal, out-of-body experiences, very common amongst the near-death experiences, but very analogous to mystical. Now look at the singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang. Timeless, outside time. There was no light, so there was no time. It was all collapsed. It was completely ordered, zero entropy. It was unified in terms of the four forces that we know. And it was dimensionless because it had no length, width, or depth, so it was outside space. Look at the analogies of these three things. I've never seen these listed myself together, but there's something beautiful about what's happening here that is beyond our imagination. The unknowable God. We can only know God by unknowing God, by letting go of our preconceived views. To me, the unknowable can be only known through unknowing. And yet you see this pattern emerging. This friend of mine, Stan Golden, saw a different pattern. And with his permission, I use this slide. The above shows the connections among nerve cells of the brain's hippocampus, a structure critical to memory and cognition. The scale is 1 inch to 1/10 of a millimeter. And below is the web-like network of aggregated matter of the known universe formed over billions of years as the universe evolved from the Big Bang to the present. Scale 1 inch equals 100 million light years. To me, the miracle of this universe leaves me in awe. And the unity that I see and how they come together in one leaves me in awe. Quantum entanglement. They bombarded calcium atoms which gave off paired photons. Paired meaning they both had the same spin. They sent these photons 12 kilometers opposite directions. They changed the spin of one. The other one changes instantly, not at the speed of light as if they were communicating, but instantly. When you compare the size of the photon to the dimensions of 12 kilometers, you might as well go across the whole universe. Communication could actually be done instantly essentially saying, the scientists were saying that the universe is non-local. Things that happen on one side can happen on the other. Another way of saying it is it's all local. The non-local universe comes from this quantum entanglement. Brian Greene, the physicist in The Fabric of the Cosmos, says the non-local universe is an earth-shattering result. This is the kind of result that should take your breath away. Einstein, what is eternally incomprehensible in the world is that it is comprehensible. Well, not when you consider Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Then later he said that the quantum non-local universe was spooky action at a distance. Interesting. So, let me back up here. Well, let me take this here. They're already experimenting with this kind of communication. They're doing it with equipment that exists. There are many, there's a lot of information on the web to show that they're looking toward communicating instantly rather than the speed of light through quantum entanglement. So this is a practical thing. Now, the reason they say at the bottom here, data transmission at least 10,000-fold faster than the speed of light, is not because it's not happening instantly, but they have to have equipment to recognize the spin change. So it's actually the equipment that's slowing it down. It's not the actual change in spin. Now, I don't have the slide here, but unpublished work by this Stan Golden, he believes that in the brain there is a signaling mechanism giving plus or minus signals, which is analogous to the use of the computer. So we'll use the base 10 system, a computer uses the base 2. It's either electricity on or off. Okay. Well, he believes that he's discovered a way in the brain that it can signal up or down, basically, on or off. So where is this all leading? Perhaps God is bringing us together. There's this concept that some authors are writing about in terms of evolutionary consciousness, that evolution is taking us into a realm and God is drawing us closer, just as Teilhard de Chardin said, God is drawing us closer and closer. And we don't know how, but we're starting to see these signs that are very interesting. So, it's 4:30. I can take some questions or